When I first arrived in America from a Europe consumed by ideological madness, I thought I had found refuge in a nation still connected to classical principles. Yet as I studied the founding documents and observed the trajectory of American thought, I discovered something far more troubling than the obvious political crises of our time. Hidden beneath America's apparent success lay the seeds of a spiritual catastrophe that the ancients had already diagnosed and warned against. The very foundations of this republic, while noble in intention, contained within them the modern philosophical assumptions that would eventually undermine not just political order, but the possibility of any meaningful human existence. What I witnessed in my decades of teaching was not merely the decline of classical education or the coarsening of political discourse, but the systematic destruction of man's capacity to recognize truth itself. The crisis I foresaw was not political but metaphysical, a complete severing of the American soul from the sources of wisdom that had sustained Western civilization for millennia. Today, as we witness the fulfillment of these predictions, we must ask ourselves whether we still possess the intellectual courage to confront what the great texts reveal about the nature of this collapse. Chapter 1: The Founder's Hidden Contradiction. The American founding presents us with a fascinating hermeneutical puzzle that reveals the deeper spiritual crisis to come. When we read the founding documents with the same careful attention we give to Plato's dialogues, we discover a fundamental tension that the founders themselves may not have fully understood. On the surface, the Declaration of Independence appeals to nature's God and self-evident truths, language that suggests a classical understanding of natural law rooted in eternal principles. Yet beneath this veneer lies a thoroughly modern philosophical foundation borrowed from Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers who had already begun the work of destroying the classical conception of human nature. The founders spoke of natural rights, but they meant something entirely different from what Aristotle understood by natural law. Where the ancients saw natural law as pointing toward human excellence and the cultivation of virtue within a political community, the moderns reduced it to a mechanism for protecting individual desires and facilitating commerce. This seemingly subtle shift contained within it the seeds of America's spiritual destruction. By grounding rights in individual will rather than in objective human flourishing, the founders inadvertently created a system that would eventually make the pursuit of truth and virtue appear arbitrary and oppressive. Consider how the founders handled the tension between reason and revelation. Unlike Maimonides or Aquinas, who developed sophisticated accounts of how philosophical inquiry and religious faith could coexist while respecting their different domains, the American approach was to privatize religion while making secular reason supreme in public affairs. This solution appeared pragmatic and tolerant, but it actually represented a capitulation to the modern assumption that ultimate questions about human purpose and cosmic order are unanswerable or irrelevant to political life. The tragedy is that many of the founders possessed genuine wisdom and understood the importance of virtue for republican government. Yet they lacked the philosophical resources to defend this understanding against the corrosive logic of modern natural rights theory. Washington's farewell address warns about the necessity of religion and morality for political happiness, but the theoretical framework of the Constitution provides no secure foundation for such claims. The result was a regime that depended on classical virtues while embracing modern principles that would eventually make those virtues incomprehensible to future generations. Chapter 2: The Poison of Historicism in American Thought. What I observed in American universities revealed the second phase of the spiritual crisis, the triumph of historicism over any conception of permanent truth. This was not merely an academic development, but a fundamental assault on the possibility of wisdom itself. American intellectuals, intoxicated by German philosophy and the apparent success of modern science, began to embrace the notion that all truth claims are historically conditioned and that human nature itself evolves over time. This historicist poison, once confined to university philosophy departments, gradually infected every aspect of American culture. The consequences were predictable to anyone familiar with the classical analysis of intellectual corruption. When Protagoras declared that man is the measure of all things, Socrates immediately recognized the nihilistic implications of such relativism. Yet American thinkers, lacking adequate philosophical education, welcomed similar ideas as expressions of democratic open-mindedness and scientific sophistication. They failed to understand that historicism, despite its claims to promote tolerance and understanding, actually makes genuine dialogue impossible by denying any common standard of truth by which competing claims might be evaluated. Consider how this historicist assumption transformed American constitutional interpretation. The founders intended the Constitution to embody certain permanent principles about human nature and political order. Yet as historicist thinking gained influence, legal scholars began to argue that constitutional meaning must evolve with changing historical circumstances. This living constitution approach represented a complete abandonment of the classical understanding that law should reflect natural justice rather than mere convention or preference. The deeper tragedy lies in how historicism corrupted Americans' understanding of their own tradition. Instead of reading the great texts of Western civilization as potential sources of wisdom about permanent human problems, students were taught to view them merely as historical artifacts reflecting the prejudices of their time. Plato's Republic became not a profound meditation on justice and the best regime, but simply an expression of ancient Greek aristocratic ideology. The Bible was reduced to a collection of myths useful for understanding ancient Near Eastern culture rather than a source of insight into the human condition. This historicist approach made Americans incapable of learning from the past because it denied that the past contained any truths relevant to contemporary problems. The result was a culture condemned to repeat the errors of previous civilizations while imagining itself to be uniquely enlightened. Americans lost the capacity to recognize that their contemporary problems, relativism, nihilism, the breakdown of authority, had been anticipated and analyzed by ancient thinkers who possessed resources for addressing them that modern thought had abandoned. Chapter 3: The Democratic Leveling of Excellence. Now I must invite you to examine honestly your own assumptions about equality and excellence. The third dimension of America's spiritual crisis emerges from the tension between democratic equality and the natural human hierarchy that philosophy requires. This is not merely a political problem but a fundamental challenge to the possibility of wisdom in a democratic age. Democracy, as Tocqueville observed, tends toward a leveling that threatens not just social distinctions but intellectual and moral ones as well. The American commitment to equality, initially limited to legal and political spheres, gradually expanded into a comprehensive egalitarianism that views any recognition of natural differences in human capacity as unjust discrimination. This development was predictable from a classical perspective. Aristotle had already analyzed how democracy tends toward the extreme of claiming that all citizens are equally qualified for all political functions, regardless of their actual virtues or abilities. What Aristotle diagnosed as a theoretical possibility became historical reality in 20th century America. The consequences for intellectual life have been catastrophic. Universities, which should serve as institutions for cultivating excellence and preserving wisdom, instead became instruments for confirming democratic prejudices. The very notion that some texts, ideas, or ways of life might be objectively superior to others came to be viewed as elitist and exclusionary. Students were encouraged to express their personal opinions rather than to struggle with texts that might challenge their assumptions or demand intellectual transformation. This democratic hostility to excellence manifests itself in what we might call the therapeutic approach to education. Instead of confronting students with their ignorance and guiding them toward genuine knowledge, the Socratic method that classical education demands, American pedagogy focuses on making students feel good about themselves and their existing beliefs. The teacher becomes not a source of authority pointing toward truth, but a facilitator helping students discover their own authentic voices. The spiritual dimension of this crisis becomes clear when we recognize that the philosophical life requires a fundamental inequality between teacher and student, between those who know and those who seek to know. Philosophy begins with the recognition of one's own ignorance and the acknowledgement that some human beings have achieved greater wisdom than others. Democratic egalitarianism makes such recognition psychologically and politically impossible. Yet the American founders themselves understood this problem and attempted to address it through institutions like the Senate and the Electoral College, which were designed to moderate direct democracy and create space for statesmanship. The gradual abandonment of these moderating institutions in favor of pure majoritarianism represents not democratic progress but a return to the very form of government that classical political science had identified as unstable and unjust. The tragedy is that genuine democracy, understood as a regime that serves the common good rather than mere majority preference, actually requires the kind of excellence and wisdom that democratic ideology increasingly rejects. A people incapable of recognizing superior virtue in their leaders will inevitably choose demagogues over statesmen, with predictable consequences for both political order and individual flourishing. Chapter 4: The Technological Assault on Contemplative Life. The fourth aspect of America's spiritual crisis involves the triumph of technological thinking over contemplative wisdom. This represents perhaps the most subtle but most destructive element of the modern assault on classical civilization. Technology, properly understood, is not merely a collection of tools but a comprehensive approach to reality that reduces all questions to problems of efficient manipulation and control. When this technological mentality becomes dominant, it makes the philosophical life impossible by transforming every aspect of human existence into material for technical management. Ancient political philosophy understood that the highest human activity is contemplation, the disinterested pursuit of truth for its own sake. Such contemplation requires leisure, not in the sense of mere recreation, but in the sense of freedom from the urgent demands of production and consumption. The technological society that America pioneered systematically destroys this possibility by subjecting every moment of human existence to the logic of efficiency and utility. Consider how technological thinking has transformed American higher education. Universities once understood themselves as institutions devoted to the pursuit of truth and the cultivation of wisdom. Students came not primarily to acquire job skills but to encounter the great questions that define human existence. Today, higher education has become a vast credentialing system designed to produce human resources for an economy that views knowledge as valuable only insofar as it contributes to material productivity. This transformation affects not just the content of education but its very spirit. Students approach texts not with the reverence and patience that wisdom requires, but with the impatience of consumers seeking immediately useful information. The careful, slow reading that allows great books to reveal their secrets becomes impossible when every intellectual activity must justify itself in terms of practical utility or career advancement. The political implications are equally profound. Democratic politics requires citizens capable of deliberating about the common good, which in turn requires some understanding of justice, virtue, and human flourishing. Yet technological thinking reduces politics to a merely technical problem of satisfying preferences and managing competing interests. Questions about the best way of life become meaningless when all ways of life are viewed as equally valid lifestyle choices. Even more disturbing is how technology shapes Americans' relationship to nature and to their own bodies. Classical political philosophy understood that human beings are political animals whose nature points toward specific excellences and forms of flourishing. Technological thinking treats human nature as raw material to be manipulated according to will and desire. The result is a culture that views everything, from sexual identity to fundamental moral commitments, as matters of choice rather than discovery. The spiritual consequences become visible in the peculiar form of nihilism that characterizes contemporary American life. Unlike the dramatic nihilism of revolutionary ideologies, American nihilism takes the form of frantic activity and endless entertainment that masks an underlying emptiness. People work furiously to acquire goods they don't really want, pursue experiences that provide no lasting satisfaction, and express opinions about questions they haven't seriously considered. This technological nihilism is particularly dangerous because it presents itself as liberation and progress. Americans imagine they are free because they can choose from an endless variety of consumer options, not recognizing that the framework within which they choose has been determined by forces they neither understand nor control. Chapter 5: The Theological Political Problem in America. Here I must invite you to consider honestly your own relationship between belief and philosophical inquiry. The fifth dimension of America's spiritual crisis involves the unresolved tension between reason and revelation that lies at the heart of Western civilization. This is what I have called the theological political problem, and it represents perhaps the most fundamental challenge facing any serious thinker in the modern world. America's unique situation, as a nation founded on Enlightenment principles but populated largely by religious believers, made this problem particularly acute and its mishandling particularly destructive. The American solution to the theological political problem was to relegate religion to the private sphere while establishing a public realm governed purely by secular reason. This approach appeared to offer the benefits of both worlds. Religious believers could maintain their faith without interference, while public policy could be conducted according to rational principles accessible to all citizens regardless of their religious commitments. Yet this solution actually satisfied neither the demands of genuine religion nor those of authentic philosophy. From the perspective of serious religious belief, the privatization of religion represents a fundamental denial of religion's claim to truth about the ultimate nature of reality. If God exists and has revealed His will for human life, then the restriction of religious concerns to private matters becomes a form of practical atheism. The founders' attempt to make religion useful for public morality while denying its cognitive claims created a sanitized civil religion that lacked the power to address ultimate questions about human existence. From the philosophical perspective, the exclusion of theological questions from serious intellectual consideration impoverished American thought by ruling out some of the most profound inquiries that had occupied the greatest minds of the Western tradition. The relationship between reason and revelation, the nature of divine providence, the possibility of miraculous intervention in natural processes, these questions had generated some of the most sophisticated philosophical analysis in the works of figures like Maimonides, Aquinas, and even Spinoza. American secular rationalism simply declared such questions irrelevant to serious thought. The result was a culture that satisfied neither religious believers seeking genuine engagement with ultimate questions nor philosophers demanding complete intellectual freedom. Religious Americans found themselves relegated to fundamentalist anti-intellectualism or liberal theology that retained religious vocabulary while abandoning religious substance. Philosophical Americans found themselves confined to technical academic specializations that avoided the most important questions about human existence. This theological political confusion became particularly evident in American universities, where the study of religion was transformed from engagement with living questions about divine truth into anthropological investigation of religious phenomena. Students learned to study religion from the outside as a cultural artifact rather than wrestling with the actual claims that religious traditions make about reality. Philosophy departments, meanwhile, abandoned traditional metaphysical and ethical inquiries in favor of linguistic analysis and logical puzzles that, however technically sophisticated, bore little relationship to the concerns that had originally motivated philosophical investigation. The deeper tragedy is that both authentic religious faith and genuine philosophical inquiry require the kind of intellectual courage and commitment that American culture increasingly discourages. Both demand acknowledgement that some questions are more important than others and that some answers might be objectively true regardless of their social or psychological consequences. Chapter 6: The Crisis of Authority and the Art of Noble Lies. The sixth aspect of America's spiritual crisis concerns the relationship between truth and political authority, a problem that leads us to question whether truth is always beneficial for political society. This brings us to one of the most delicate and potentially dangerous aspects of classical political philosophy, the recognition that political communities require certain beliefs and loyalties that may not withstand rigorous philosophical examination. The American experiment represents a unique attempt to found a political order on philosophical principles, yet the success of this experiment depends on citizens accepting certain claims that philosophy itself calls into question. Consider the American teaching about natural rights and human equality. The political effectiveness of these doctrines requires that citizens accept them as self-evident truths rather than as philosophical hypotheses open to debate. Yet anyone who seriously studies the history of political philosophy knows that these claims are neither self-evident nor universally accepted by intelligent observers. The assertion that all men are created equal, for instance, conflicts with obvious evidence about natural differences in human capacity and achievement. This creates what we might call the American paradox. The political order depends on philosophical principles, yet the widespread philosophical examination of those principles might undermine the convictions necessary for political stability. The founders seemed to recognize this problem intuitively, which is why they spoke of truths as self-evident rather than as conclusions reached through argument. They needed citizens to accept certain beliefs with the kind of immediate conviction that philosophical inquiry tends to weaken. The classical tradition had developed sophisticated approaches to this problem through what Plato called noble lies, teachings that serve the political good even if they cannot be demonstrated with philosophical rigor. These were not crude deceptions but carefully crafted accounts that conveyed important truths about justice and human excellence in forms accessible to non-philosophers. The American founding documents can be read as attempts to create similar noble lies appropriate for a modern democratic society. The crisis emerges when the distinction between exoteric teaching, suitable for public consumption, and esoteric knowledge, appropriate for philosophical investigation, breaks down. American universities, which should have preserved this distinction by maintaining spaces for genuine philosophical inquiry while respecting the political necessity of public beliefs, instead began subjecting all beliefs to the same kind of critical scrutiny. The result was the systematic undermining of the convictions that democratic citizenship requires. This process accelerated when academic intellectuals began to view their role as enlightening the masses rather than preserving wisdom. Instead of recognizing that different truths might be appropriate for different audiences, they assumed that what they discovered in their specialized investigations should be immediately communicated to the general public. The consequences were predictable. Citizens lost confidence in their political traditions without gaining the philosophical sophistication necessary to understand why those traditions had been valuable. The contemporary crisis of authority in American society reflects this deeper confusion about the relationship between knowledge and power. When citizens are taught to question everything but given no criteria for distinguishing between legitimate and illegitimate authority, they become susceptible to both anarchic individualism and demagogic manipulation. The classical understanding that authority must be based on genuine excellence becomes incomprehensible to people who have been taught that all claims to superiority are arbitrary impositions of power. The task for those who understand this problem is extraordinarily delicate. We must preserve both the possibility of philosophical inquiry and the political conditions that make such inquiry possible. This requires a kind of prudence that recognizes the legitimate needs of political society while maintaining commitment to truth as the highest good. Chapter 7: The Return to Great Books as America's Salvation. The final dimension of our analysis points toward the only genuine solution to America's spiritual crisis, a return to the great books of the Western tradition studied with the kind of careful attention that reveals their permanent wisdom. This is not merely an academic exercise but a recovery of the intellectual and moral resources necessary for human flourishing in any age. The great texts contain insights about justice, virtue, and the best way of life that remain as relevant today as when they were first written, but only for readers willing to approach them with the reverence and patience that wisdom demands. The first step in this recovery requires acknowledging that contemporary Americans, despite their technological sophistication, are in fundamental respects less wise than the ancients who created our civilization. This acknowledgement goes against every assumption of progressive ideology, which treats historical development as necessarily improvement. Yet anyone who compares Plato's analysis of democracy with contemporary American political discourse, or Aristotle's account of friendship with modern theories about interpersonal relationships, must recognize that we have lost capacities for understanding that previous generations possessed. The great books offer us not merely historical information about how people once thought, but living encounters with minds of extraordinary power grappling with permanent human problems. When we read Plato's Republic with genuine openness, we discover not ancient Greek prejudices but penetrating insights into the nature of justice that illuminate contemporary political problems. When we study Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, we find not outdated moral theories but sophisticated analysis of human excellence that remains unsurpassed by modern psychology or social science. The art of reading these texts properly requires recovering what I have called the esoteric dimension of classical writing. The greatest philosophers wrote with extraordinary care, embedding their most important teachings in the structure and contradictions of their texts rather than stating them directly. This was not mere literary ornamentation but philosophical necessity. The most profound truths about human existence are too dangerous or too difficult to communicate through simple assertion. They must be discovered through the kind of active intellectual engagement that transforms the reader in the process of understanding. This approach to reading offers several crucial benefits for addressing America's spiritual crisis. First, it cultivates the intellectual virtues, patience, precision, intellectual courage, that democratic citizenship requires but contemporary education systematically undermines. Students who learn to read Plato carefully develop capacities for analysis and judgment that make them less susceptible to demagogic manipulation and more capable of genuine political deliberation. Second, engagement with great texts provides access to alternative ways of understanding perennial human problems that our contemporary intellectual resources cannot address. The crisis of authority that paralyzes American politics becomes comprehensible when we study classical accounts of the relationship between knowledge and power. The spiritual emptiness that characterizes modern life appears in new light when we encounter ancient analyses of happiness and human flourishing. Third, the great books offer models of intellectual excellence that can inspire contemporary efforts to achieve wisdom. When we see how figures like Maimonides navigated the tension between reason and revelation, or how Aquinas synthesized classical philosophy with religious faith, we gain confidence that intelligent human beings can address even the most difficult theoretical and practical problems. The ultimate goal of such education is not academic expertise but the formation of character and the development of practical wisdom. Americans who rediscover their connection to the classical tradition will find themselves better equipped to address contemporary challenges precisely because they will understand those challenges within a larger context of permanent human possibilities and limitations. The recovery of classical political philosophy thus represents not escapism or nostalgia but the most practical possible response to America's current crisis. Only by returning to the sources of Western wisdom can Americans hope to preserve what is valuable in their political tradition while correcting the errors that threaten its destruction. Conclusion. The spiritual crisis I foresaw has now reached its full development in American society, yet this very fulfillment of dire predictions creates an opportunity for genuine recovery. When superficial solutions have been exhausted and fashionable ideologies have revealed their bankruptcy, serious human beings naturally turn toward the permanent resources of wisdom that have sustained civilization through previous crises. The breakdown of contemporary American culture, properly understood, clears the ground for rediscovering the classical insights that our ancestors foolishly abandoned. This recovery will not be easy or automatic. It requires the kind of intellectual courage that chooses the difficult path of genuine learning over the comfortable illusions that our culture promotes. Yet for those willing to undertake this journey, the rewards are extraordinary, not merely academic knowledge but practical wisdom, not merely historical information but living encounter with the greatest minds our civilization has produced. The choice before thoughtful Americans is ultimately between two ways of life: the easy path of intellectual conformism that accepts contemporary assumptions without examination, or the demanding but ultimately satisfying adventure of philosophical inquiry that seeks truth regardless of its social or personal consequences. The first path leads to the spiritual death that characterizes so much of contemporary existence. The second opens onto the possibility of genuine human flourishing rooted in understanding of permanent truth. Those who choose philosophy will find themselves part of a tradition that extends back to Socrates and forward to anyone willing to take up the challenge of thinking seriously about the most important questions. This is the only genuine hope for America's spiritual renewal.